Hi everyone, welcome to your Protists and Fungi video notes. So we're going to start off with some protists. A little introduction for you. You need to know, first of all, that all protists are eukaryotes. So these are the smallest animals that are eukaryotes, and most of them are single-celled. They can reproduce both asexually and sexually, and they were also considered the first eukaryotes on Earth. Another really big thing you need to know is that they must have moisture to survive. Before we get too much into the different types of protists, let's talk about how eukaryotes came to be in the first place. When we want to talk about that, we talk about something called endosymbiosis, or the endosymbiotic theory. So this is a theory that explains the origin of eukaryotes and other organelles like mitochondria and chloroplast. And the idea is a large prokaryote ate a smaller prokaryote, and instead of digesting it and eating it, the smaller one lived inside of the large one, and they lived happily ever after, or symbiotically, eventually over time evolving into a single organism that has organelles inside of it, like our eukaryotes. Now that we know a little bit about how eukaryotes came to be, let's talk about how protists are classified. First of all, you need to know they are classified by how they get their nutrition. So heterotroph, autotroph, and saprotroph are the three major terms we're going to use here. Animal-like protists, just like animals, are heterotrophs. They need to consume food for energy. Plant-like protists, just like plants, are autotrophs, meaning they can make their own food. And then fungus-like protists are what you would expect, kind of like fungi. They're saprotrophs. They feed on dead or decaying matter. Let's first talk about the animal-like protists then. Like we said, they're heterotrophs, they're single-celled, and they eat other things like algae, bacteria, or other protists. Another term you need to be familiar with is the term protozoans, which essentially means pre-animals, and this is what animal-like protists are referred to. Also important to know, these specific protists are grouped based on how they move. We're not going to get into the phyla with this course, but if you ever take another biology course, you will learn about all the different phyla, and they are all grouped based on whether they move with a flagella, cilia, or this really cool thing called a pseudopod. Now let's look at some examples. First of all, an amoeba. An amoeba is probably the most well-known animal-like protist, and they move using something called a pseudopod. So if you see all these little projections sticking out here, that's how they move, and that's also how they consume their food. Hence the cute little comic over here about amoeba hugs being fatal, because if they hug you with your pseudopod, they're actually taking something in as food. Another very well-known protist that's an animal-like is a paramecium, which is down here. Paramecium move using their cilia. And then two others that you should be aware of are things like Giardia, which has flagella, as you see, and this causes sickness, usually if you touch your face after touching soil that had fecal matter in it, and Coccidia, which can cause sickness in dogs. Now on to plant-like protists. So plant-like protists, like we said, are autotrophs, and this time they can also be multicellular. We're going to talk about an example in a minute that you might not realize is a protist. And this time their cell walls are made of cellulose, just like plants are, and they have chlorophyll, but other pigments as well. So it's important to note that these protists are very colorful, and they do produce 70% of the Earth's oxygen. That is huge. These protists are so important to our existence on Earth. And these ones are classified based on either color and pigment or their structure. So there's 6 examples we're going to talk about. Green algae and brown algae, or kelp, are two very commonly known plant-like protists. Kelp is the one I was talking about. Kelp looks a lot like seaweed, and you may think it was actually a plant, but in reality, it's a plant-like protist. Something else you might not know if you enjoy your ice cream is red algae is used to thicken ice cream. Or if you have sushi wrapped in seaweed, that's the kind you're eating. Dinoflagellates are kind of the bad guys. They cause red tides. Euglenoids are really popular, and these are common in lakes or streams, and you can see their color, right? They're green. They have lots of chloroplasts inside. And lastly, a kind of fun one is diatoms. These are my favorite. They have a hard outer shell, and they have lots of really cool shapes, and they're really common in toothpaste and road paint. So at home tonight, look at this this ingredient here and see if that's in any of your toothpaste. If it is, that is a substance that's derived from protists. And lastly, we have fungus-like protists. So these ones are also heterotrophs, but they feed on dead or decaying matter, so they're known as saprotrophs or saprophytes. Their cell walls also contain cellulose, which is unlike fungus, which have chitin as their cell walls. And some examples here, slime molds, water molds, and if you've ever had a fish tank, you know that ick is something that can be really, really bad for your fish. This is also a fungus-like protist. Now let's move on to fungi. So fungi are a little bit different than protists. They can be unicellular or multicellular, but look at here. They're also eukaryotic. They are heterotrophs, meaning they must consume other things for food, but they're decomposers. And this time their cell walls are composed of chitin, which is unlike fungus-like protists and plants, which have cell walls of cellulose. There's a couple important structures then that we need to focus on with fungi in general. So in general, when you think of fungi, I'm sure the first thing that comes to mind is a mushroom. So think about this in terms of high surface area to volume ratio, meaning there's a large area, so look at this mushroom here, but if you pick up a mushroom, they're not very heavy and there's not much to them, right? They're pretty kind of light and airy. So this helps them with what they need to do, which the mushrooms you're seeing are actually the reproductive structures. So the hyphae, and we look over here, is that stringy-like substance that makes up the body of the fruiting body. And it's great for nutrient absorption, and it's specifically adapted for growing on something solid. The mycelium then is a very similar structure, but this is underground, and it's the net-like mass that's underground. This is also why when you cut your grass, if you cut a mushroom, it's going to regrow somewhere else because all of that mycelium is still underground. And then lastly, the fruiting body, which in general is the above ground portion of the fungi. So there's also different ways that fungi get their nutrition. So they can be saprotrophs, like we talked about. They're decomposers, they recycle nutrients, they're really important in forest decay, like this dead tree here. We also have mutualistic relationships. These fungi are great. Farmers love them. They're really great for crop growth, which we'll talk about briefly at the end of this, which is mycorrhizae, and lichens are also important. And lastly, they can be parasitic. So they absorb nutrients from living cells of another organism and they grow from that. So if you look at this picture here that popped up, you'll see it's an ant, but if you watch slowly, you'll see there's actually a fruiting body coming out of the head of that ant. So this is a disease that grows, it takes over the ant and then it grows out of their bodies. Another really common thing you need to know about is Dutch elm disease. So this is killing lots and lots of elm trees because of this fungus. So in terms of reproduction, fungi once again can reproduce sexually or asexually. So spore production, if you'll notice, I put a little star there, is both asexual or sexual reproduction. But asexually, fungi can also reproduce via budding, which we'll talk about in more detail, and fragmentation. When we talk about reproduction, the most important thing is the structures. How do they do it? So a sporophore is the fruiting body of the fungus. That's that above ground portion that has the spores. And if you look here, the classification of fungi into their different phyla is actually based on the type of sporophore they produce. So the fruiting body itself is what produces the spores, and the spores have lots of different adaptations for survival, which I'll show you right here. So there's the typical, you see a mushroom in your yard, it has spores, they get released, more fungi grow, etc. This is a result of fluid buildup, and it affects that cell volume, causing those spores to be ejected. But there's some other fun ways. So some other methods include things like bird's nest fungi, which relies on water drops. So if you watch this little clip here, you see all that dust or powder you see exploding is actually the spores. I'm sure all of you at some point have had fun with the puffball mushrooms. You kick them and they poof everywhere. You're actually releasing all their spores when you kick them. And then stinkhorns, they stink, just like you would think. They smell like poop and they attract insects like flies. And then those insects get the spores on their bodies and they go somewhere else and they drop the spores off. Let's go back then to the asexual method. So budding is one method of asexual reproduction, and this is simply, it's kind of like cloning. They essentially pinch a piece of themselves off to make something new, and then bingo, you have a parent cell and a baby cell. And this is really common in yeast cells, and you can see that in this picture here. The other method of asexual reproduction that you might not be familiar with is fragmentation. So it's exactly what it sounds like. The mycelia, which is that underground portion, is going to break into fragments, as you see depicted in this picture here. And then if the fragments go somewhere where fungi growth is great, they will continue to grow and they will grow new fungi. This also occurs typically in fungi that have lost the ability to produce spores, things like foot fungus, which I hope none of you ever have to deal with. And now let's talk about the classification. So if you remember, the classification depends on the type of sporophore that's produced. So we have 5 different ones here, and really the only thing you need to know is the phylum name and then the example. The little things below are just to kind of help you as well. So the Chytridiomycota are tritrids, and they have flagellated spores, meaning they have little tails, and they rely on water to move. Then you have Zygomycota, which I'm sure you've all seen. These are the common molds, such as bread molds that grow on the bread in your cabinet. We have Ascomycota, which are your sac fungi. Yeast is the most popular one here, but also Penicillium, which produces penicillin, and truffles if you eat mushrooms. Basidiomycota are your typical mushrooms. They're the ones that you see that you eat. These are known as club fungi. And then Deuteromycota are your imperfect fungi. So these aren't so great, right? They cause yeast infections, athlete's foot. We don't really like these ones. So as I mentioned, we were going to get into symbiotic relationships. So there's 2 different beneficial relationships you need to be aware of. The first is lichens. So lichens are the relationship between fungi and algae. If you remember, algae is a plant like protist. The algae provides food for both of them, and the fungi provides this nice little web that lets the algae grow. This is also known as a bioindicator, so it's very sensitive to environmental changes. So if there's pollution or something major going on, they will die. Then we have mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae is another symbiotic relationship, but this time it's between fungi and plant roots. And farmers really like these guys. So they help absorb minerals for the plant, but then the hyphae, as it spreads, it increases that plant root surface area, helping the plant take in more nutrients, more minerals, more water, and then the fungi, as a result, gets carbs and amino acids from the plant. If you look here, here's showing plants with and without, and then also without and with, and look at that difference in root growth. So of course, we know the bad stuff about fungi, but there are some really great things. Things like bioremediation. So we recycle nutrients to clean the environment. Imagine a forest if you had no fungi. There would be dead, smelly trees, animals, things everywhere. So they're really important to clean the environment. You also have medicines, so a source of penicillin, and then also to reduce high blood pressure and even promote contractions during childbirth. And then of course, foods, right? Some people love to eat mushrooms. I personally do not enjoy mushrooms. I like bread. So yeast is good, but alcohol and cheese are also types of fungi. So if you have blue cheese, that's a fungus. Oops. And that is all for your notes.